So you mentioned earlier Rick Doblin and MAPS. Why don't we talk about what happened recently? It was in June of 2024. The FDA decided to, I guess, deny.
Yes.
Deny. What would you call it? Deny.
So it's called like a new drug application,
Right.
NDA.
Yes.
And so, yeah, you know, we thought the science was really solid. And so this was somewhat of a surprise. And it was actually quite recently that the FDA released what's called the CRL, which is the complete response letter. So we now actually know what some of their concerns were.
Yes.
I think just to give a bit of the context. So MAPS was initially a nonprofit. It raised $150 million in pure philanthropic donations to move MDMA through the drug development process. And they made it almost to the end of phase 3 before they ran out of money. And so at that point, it pivoted to become a for-profit called Lykos. And that was towards the end of the second phase 3 trial. And I want to start by saying like the results that we got in these trials were really solid. So we were treating people with severe chronic PTSD. They had PTSD for an average of 15 years. They had failed other treatments, and 67% no longer met criteria for PTSD in the active group.
Is there a current accepted treatment for PTSD in terms of a pharmaceutical?
There are a couple antidepressants that are approved, but they're not. Their effect size isn't that significant.
That was my question.
Yeah.
The 67%
That's
is
like way higher than what we have. Yeah.
Okay, so promising.
Very promising. And actually, like the safety profile is quite good. Like it actually, what we were seeing at these sites, I was involved in these trials, is that like for most people, this is quite safe and effective. So the AdCom voted against approving it. The FDA didn't have to go with that decision, but they typically do, especially when the AdCom says no. I will say the advisory committee many of these people didn't have any understanding of psychotherapy or psychedelics. And even they were saying we're out of our lane. And you could see the stigma in some of the people in the committee. One physician was worried that like people would take MDMA in the trial and go home and do cocaine with their partner. And so you see some of the anti-drug stigma. But anyways, so the FDA declined to approve this NDA, and now we have the complete response letter. So their concerns, one was that we didn't record positive adverse events. I think that this was maybe part of just going first and being the first out of the gate. So for example, we didn't record euphoria as an adverse event. But
is that something that's commonly recorded? I've never heard of a positive adverse events.
So they're saying it could increase abuse potential. I think this is where it's actually really challenging to like figure out how to record adverse events in psychedelics, because so many of the effects are actually part of how it works. Like, for example, I have to record like grief, except like processing grief is how the patients get better.
Right.
But from like a side effect profile. So there's a bit of a paradigm clash, I think, that's going on. So they were concerned about that. I think that the argument is we actually have pretty good like evidence about the abuse potential of MDMA, and it's not like compared to other drugs they've approved, like ketamine, much more addictive, benzodiazepines, opiates. Like they've approved way more addictive drugs than MDMA. We know that it can be abused, but it's not a common drug of abuse. Their other concern was that 40% of the patients had previously taken MDMA. And so they were saying that's a selection bias. They're more likely to be unblinded. They'll know what it feels like to be on MDMA. And they're more likely to think that it had a positive effect.
Right.
When we looked at the data, though, the people that had taken it before and also hadn't taken it before did equally well.
Right.
And I think it's important to remember that it's not just it's not just the drug, it's the whole therapy. It was 3 MDMA sessions, 12 other psychotherapy sessions, an 18-week protocol. And so people taking it recreationally, it's like a very different experience than taking it with the intention of processing trauma and healing. That was a concern. I will say that, again, that's like I think a clash. Like the reality on the ground of like trying to run these clinical trials is that clinically, the people that are more drawn to trying a psychedelic often are more open to new experiences and very often have tried psychedelics. Like even in our cancer population, I would say half our participants have taken psilocybin before. And in a way that makes them, I think, better candidates. They actually know what they're signing up for. They understand the terrain a little bit.
Right.
So, but I understand that's the clinician in me talking. But from like a research perspective, to have a really clean sample is better data. And so that was part of their argument.
Right. I think what you're describing in statistics is, would you call it a confounding variable or a confounding aspect or situation? But you're right. I mean, that makes total sense. I got a question for you in terms of protocol, because I think it's lost on people when they think about this situation or psychedelic therapy in general. It might be lost on them, the therapy aspect that we're talking about, the psychotherapy. So when you're running a research trial like this, you have how many participants?
So the MAPS trial is like the first phase 3 trial had about 90.
Okay, I was going to say 100. So 90. So how many, practically speaking, how many therapists are involved with 90 subjects?
Well, that particular trial had 12 sites all across the US, 2 in Canada, and you probably have 2 to 4 therapists at each site, even more.
What I'm getting at is the possible variability in the way that therapists would do their psychotherapy, which might skew numbers one way or the other. But it's an interesting thing because like you said in the onset.
There's adherence. So all the therapists had to do a case before they were part of the trial that was watched by adherence raters, and there's scales and they had to go through a training, and there's a manual. So there's ways to try to standardize it. I mean, I think you're absolutely right that there's going to be variability, and there's also variability in fit, right? Like sometimes there's just a natural fit between a therapist and a patient.
Yeah, exactly. But despite that, you still got very good numbers.
Yeah. I will say the other thing that the FDA was concerned about was that PTSD is a chronic condition, and we only had data up to 18 weeks, and they wanted us to follow people for longer and keeping them blinded. But ethically, we wanted to have a crossover study where those who got the placebo, the sugar pill, could then get the high dose MDMA sessions, as we thought that was important ethically and for recruitment.
Outside of the research study.
Follow-up study. It's like a crossover study. Gotcha. But because of the crossover study, that prevents you from being able to follow people for as long in a blinded way.
Makes sense, yes.
And then also we did have a long-term follow-up study, but some of the patients, had now done the crossover. Others had engaged in other forms of treatment. And so it wasn't the data. Was impossible. Not super meaningful. Yeah.
So can you speak to the FDA's issue with the functional unblinding? Because I think it's a valid point. Meaning, how do you blind somebody to a psychedelic when you take it and you know what's going on?
This is a big problem in the psychedelic field, and it's going to be a problem like across the board with really any psychedelic. It's actually not unique to psychedelics. I'd say it's more dramatic with psychedelics.
Yes.
But in a lot of drug trials, like even in the trials of antipsychotics, like the patients would start developing side effects and gaining weight, and they can tell when they're on the active drug. So it's not unique to psychedelics, but it's very dramatic. Like it's pretty obvious to the patient, to the therapist who got the active drug. And so this is, again, I think we might have to look at different, we have this gold standard of the double-blind randomized control trial, but then we have these treatments that don't really fit that. And then people say, well, we can never show that it's effective, but it works. And so we might need other ways of generating evidence, like looking at mechanism of action, looking at the brain and how it might change before and after. When MAPS was originally designing the trial, they actually worked with the FDA, and the FDA said one way to reduce this is to have external raters. So the people doing like the primary outcome, which in this case was the CAP-5, it's the PTSD scale. They had no connection to the site or the patient. They were, completely separate. That was one way to try to reduce.
Okay, so you're
some
blinding the data. Yeah.
The other thing, so what was I going to say? The other thing is that in the phase 2, MAPS tried comparing low dose MDMA to higher dose MDMA, and that actually did blind people better. But the problem is low dose MDMA makes people really anxious. So it actually has an anti-therapeutic effect. So it would make it look like the high dose is actually outperforming. So it
there might be some ethical issues there too.
That was a challenge. Yeah. So
interesting.
So the FDA actually didn't want MAPS to use low dose MDMA as the comparator.
Could you blind somebody with a different drug altogether?
I think there's been talk about that, like using like methylphenidate or another stimulant, like an amphetamine.
Right.
And in some of the end of life trials, they're using ketamine as a comparator for psilocybin. So there might be other ways to do it. You might find though that like amphetamine assisted psychotherapy actually works too.
Right. It might work as well.
Yeah.
So where does that, so that trial's done now. So Lykos has gone back, correct me if I'm wrong, to being a research.
So they
group.
had to like I think let like 75% of their staff go because they were really preparing for commercialization.
Right.
And so they're back to like being an R&D company. I think it was sold to some new investors. It's rebranded to Resilient Pharmaceuticals. And I know that I think there's going to be independent review of all the data and potentially a resubmission, but also preparing to do more phase 3 trials.
Right. That's interesting.
The other thing that the FDA said in this complete response letter that I think kind of concerned me is they wanted to have an arm where there's no therapy. And I really worry about giving traumatized patients
an arm of the study,
just pure MDMA with no therapeutic component. And I get why, like empirically and like theoretically, that's like valuable. And yet I actually really don't know how ethical it is to give, traumatized patients, MDMA and bring up their trauma and then not support them to process that.
You're asking them to do it recreationally, basically.
Almost, yeah.
Right.
Like that doesn't like sit well with me. Like our patients needed a lot of support through the trial. We had to add like phone calls every other day in between the sessions. It was really intense inner work and they really needed the support of the 2 therapists. So it's hard to imagine the ethics of that trial. Yeah.
So what sort of research are you currently working on?
Right now, we're working on a trial that it's called PEARL and stands for Psilocybin-Assisted Existential Attachment and Relational Therapy.
Okay.
It's a bit of a mouthful. It was designed for patients with advanced cancer. And so there's 4 preparation sessions, a high-dose psilocybin, and 3 integration sessions. And that we haven't talked a lot about integration, but really what happens after you take the psychedelic is really, also really important. And one of the things that we're learning is that psychedelics open these windows of neuroplasticity in the brain. And so they make your brain changeable for a period of time after. And I think it's important to note that neuroplasticity is neutral. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to have positive change.
Right.
And that's why we think the integration therapy and the support after is so important to help direct some of that changeability into positive shifts for people.